530 AD. When genius defied the odds, 7,000 Byzantine warriors crushed 40,000 Persian invaders. On June 530 AD, the Mesopotamian sun beats down mercilessly on the dusty plains near Dara. Belisarius stands on the battlements, his eyes scanning the horizon where dust clouds swallow the sky. From his vantage point, the 25-year-old general watches an endless horde approaching, a living sea of steel and silk stretching across the flat terrain. 40,000 Persian warriors advance with the confidence of conquerors. Against this overwhelming tide, Belisarius commands exactly 7,000 mixed troops, Byzantine regulars, Hun mercenaries, Herulian allies. The mathematics are simple and terrifying. Nearly 6 enemies for every one of his soldiers. The odds that would break any ordinary commander's resolve. Yet Belisarius doesn't flinch. His jaw sets with determination. Because today, he's about to rewrite the rules of warfare itself. Picture this. You're standing atop Dara's fortified walls, heat shimmering off the stone battlements. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, leather, and horse. Your scouts have just returned, their faces pale with news that chills your blood despite the scorching heat. Not 20,000 enemies as you feared, not even 30,000. A full 40,000 Persian invaders march toward your position. Armored in overlapping scale and chainmail, their silk banners flutter like flames in the desert wind. War drums echo across the plains. The earth itself trembles beneath tens of thousands of hooves. That's nearly 6 enemies for every one of your soldiers. The kind of odds that end careers, that topple empires. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the Iberian War in 530 AD. Belisarius wasn't supposed to win this fight. He wasn't even supposed to survive it. Fresh from earlier border skirmishes, he faced not just military threats but political intrigue back home in Constantinople. At just 25 years old, he battled constant doubts about his youth and inexperience from jealous rivals. Yet facing him stood Perazes, the seasoned Persian Spabad, a commander who had crushed Byzantine forces before, a victor of multiple campaigns against Eastern foes, a general who commanded the respect and fear of the entire Sassanid military establishment. Experience versus youth. Numbers versus desperation. The old order versus radical innovation. The stage was set for what should have been a massacre. Instead, it became a legend. The Byzantine situation was more desperate than most people realize. The Iberian War had been raging since 527 AD, ignited when Sassanid King Kavad III attempted to force the Christian Iberians in the Caucasus to convert to Zoroastrianism. When the Iberian king fled to Byzantine protection, diplomatic negotiations collapsed spectacularly. Emperor Justin I had initially agreed to adopt Kavad's son Khosrau in a gesture of peace. But the terms, a right reserved for barbarians, insulted Persian pride. The insult festered. Relations deteriorated. By the time Justin's nephew Justinian inherited the throne in 527, war was inevitable. The Persians had rebuilt their grand army at Nisibis, just miles from Byzantine territory. They commanded 40,000 men, including the legendary Immortals, 10,000 elite heavy cavalry clad in lamellar armor that could turn away arrows and sword strikes. These shock troops could shatter defensive lines with devastating lance charges. Behind them marched 20,000 heavy cavalry, the backbone of Persian military might. Supporting them, 10,000 archers and infantry units capable of raining death from afar with composite bows that outranged most Byzantine weapons. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a full invasion force designed to crush Byzantine resistance and capture Dara itself, the fortress that had been a thorn in Persian ambitions since its recent fortification. Back in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian's position was precarious. His rivals in the Senate and among the military aristocracy waited like vultures for any sign of weakness. One major defeat, one catastrophic loss, and Belisarius's career would end in disgrace, or worse. Justinian himself might face plots and conspiracies. This wasn't just another border campaign. This was Belisarius's final gamble for securing the eastern frontier. for proving that youth and innovation could triumph over age and tradition, for showing that the Byzantine Empire still had the strength to stand against the Persian colossus. Failure meant more than military defeat. It meant the collapse of Byzantine credibility, the loss of Mesopotamia, the potential invasion of Syria and Anatolia itself. Everything hung in the balance on these dusty plains outside Dara. The morning had started as routine as any patrol. Belisarius needed to secure supplies for his 7,000 troops camped in and around Dara's fortifications. The local terrain favored his enemies completely. Unlike the forested highlands of Anatolia or the broken ground of the Taurus Mountains, this Mesopotamian plain offered endless space for the one thing Persians did better than anyone: cavalry sweeps. Open ground, clear sight lines, perfect conditions for the Persian military machine to operate at maximum efficiency. Their composite bows, their heavily armored lancers, their experienced commanders, all of it optimized for exactly this type of engagement. Then the scouts returned with news that changed everything. The Persian force that emerged from the dust was beyond comprehension. 40,000 warriors moved like a storm of arrows and hooves, their formations stretching from horizon to horizon. Perozes commanded a breakdown of forces that represented the full might of the Sassanid Empire. 10,000 elite immortals, the Jayadan, armored in overlapping scales and chain, mounted on war horses bred for size and endurance. These were the men who had broken armies from the steppes of Central Asia to the mountains of Armenia, veterans of a dozen campaigns, each one worth 3 ordinary soldiers. 20,000 heavy cavalry, the Aswaran, noble warriors who had trained for war since childhood, equipped with long lances, swords, and the deadly composite bow, capable of both shock charges and mobile archery. The kind of flexible force that had conquered half the known world. 10,000 archers and infantry support units, including Dalamite mountain warriors and conscripted levies. Capable of raining volleys that could darken the sky, supporting fire that could pin down enemy formations while cavalry maneuvered for the killing blow. Against this, Belisarius had 7,000 men, perhaps 3,000 Byzantine regular cavalry and infantry, 600 Hun mercenary horsemen skilled in mounted archery but lightly armored, 600 Herulian Germanic warriors, fierce but undisciplined. The rest, a mix of local levies and auxiliary troops of questionable reliability. In any conventional engagement, the outcome was predetermined. The Persians would fix the Byzantine center with arrow fire, then sweep around the flanks with overwhelming cavalry numbers. Standard doctrine, proven tactics, inevitable victory. Perozes knew it. His officers knew it. Even some of Belisarius's own commanders knew it. But Belisarius was about to prove that conventional wisdom was just another limitation to overcome. Here's what the sources don't tell you about Belisarius's tactical situation that morning. His scout reports had shown only partial enemy movements. Advance elements, forward cavalry screens. The kind of forces you'd expect for a probing attack or reconnaissance in force. The reality was something far more terrifying. A full invasion force was closing in, and the trap had been months in preparation. The Persians understood Byzantine supply vulnerabilities better than most Byzantine generals did. Dara, despite its recent fortifications, was isolated. Supply lines stretched back through hostile or uncertain territory. Any commander stationed there faced a constant dilemma: stay behind walls and starve, or venture out and risk being caught in the open. Perozes had studied Byzantine patterns. He knew that aggressive young commanders like Belisarius preferred action to passivity. The Persians had even scattered false intelligence about weaker forces, about exposed flanks, about opportunities for a quick victory. Anything to draw the Byzantines out from behind their walls. A careful, patient enemy could exploit Belisarius's aggressive nature by offering what appeared to be a vulnerable target. Then, when the Byzantines committed, the full Persian force would emerge and annihilate them in the open. As the first Persian banners appeared on the horizon that morning, Belisarius's advisors should have ordered immediate retreat. Standard military doctrine demanded it. Every tactical manual, every precedent from centuries of Roman warfare said the same thing. When outnumbered 6-1, withdraw to fortified positions. Use walls and towers to multiply your defensive strength. Force the enemy into a siege where numbers matter less. But Belisarius had spent his entire career proving that standard doctrine was written for ordinary commanders. Men who thought inside the boundaries of tradition, who won by following established rules. Belisarius won by rewriting them. As he stood on those battlements watching 40,000 enemies deploy across the plains, his mind was already racing through possibilities. The subtle rises in the supposedly flat terrain, the prevailing wind patterns, the psychological state of his own troops versus Persian overconfidence, the hours of daylight remaining, the distances involved. Other commanders saw an impossible situation. Belisarius saw a chessboard where unconventional moves could create unexpected victories. The trap the Persians had laid was about to spring on them instead. Inside Dara's command tent, the war council had devolved into barely controlled panic. Canvas walls offered little protection from the blistering heat that sent waves of exhaustion through already worried men. Belisarius paced the length of the space, his young face etched with lines of determination that made him seem older than his 25 years. Every officer in that chamber knew what the scouts had reported. The numbers had been confirmed and reconfirmed. 40,000 Persians were marching toward their position with the inevitability of a desert sandstorm. The math was inescapable. The conclusion seemed obvious. Hermogenes, the Magister Officiorum, the senior civilian official attached to the military command, spoke what everyone was thinking. His voice carried the weight of administrative authority and political connection to Constantinople. "General, we must withdraw into the fortress, or risk total annihilation. 40,000 against our 7,000. The emperor would understand. Preservation of the army must take precedence." Others nodded agreement, relief visible on their faces that someone had finally said it aloud. John the Armenian, Belisarius's childhood friend and most trusted cavalry commander, suggested a middle course. "Perhaps we could send for reinforcements from Amida or Martyropolis, buy time with skirmishes while heavier forces march to our aid." Even the bold Hunnic allied commanders, men who had faced steppe warriors and survived battles most Romans couldn't imagine, remained conspicuously silent. Sunicas and Agin exchanged glances, but offered no encouragement. The situation was that desperate, that seemingly hopeless. The tent fell silent except for the sound of wind against canvas and the distant rumble of Persian war drums growing ever closer. Then Belisarius did something that stunned even his closest advisors. He stopped pacing. He turned to face them all, and despite the overwhelming odds arrayed against him, his voice, when it came, was clear and carried to every corner of the command tent. "We fight here, where God has placed us, where duty demands we stand." The room erupted. Officers spoke over each other. Had the heat driven him mad? Did he not understand the mathematics of warfare? Even Alexander had known when to withdraw and regroup. Belisarius raised his hand, and the authority in that gesture silenced them more effectively than shouting. "We will not retreat into the fortress. We will fortify the field itself. Dig trenches at angles, not straight lines. Leave gaps for cavalry sorties. We'll use the terrain's subtle rises to hide reserve forces. The Persians expect us to cower behind walls. Instead, we'll offer battle on ground of our choosing, using methods they've never seen." Hermogenes looked aghast. "General, with respect, this violates every principle. Every principle written by men who never faced what we face now," Belisarius interrupted. "The Persians have numbers. We have necessity. They have confidence. We have desperation. And desperate men, fighting on ground they've prepared, following tactics the enemy doesn't expect. Those men can achieve the impossible." He looked each commander in the eye. "The troops begin digging within the hour. Every man who can hold a shovel or a weapon. We make our stand here, today. And when the histories are written, they'll remember not the odds we faced, but the victory we achieved." In that moment, doubt gave way to something else. Not quite confidence. The numbers were too stark for that. But perhaps belief, perhaps hope, perhaps the understanding that following this young general into madness might be the sanest course of all. Because if anyone could transform 6-to-1 odds into victory, it was the man who had just redefined the very concept of defensive warfare. What happened next defied every principle of military logic that had governed warfare for 1,000 years. Instead of retreating behind Dara's walls, Belisarius ordered the men to march out and fortify the field itself with an intricate system of ditches and defensive works. The troops would deploy within the hour, taking every man who could hold a weapon. No reserves left in the city. No fallback position. Everything committed to this single desperate gambit. The insanity of the plan was breathtaking. March miles through scorching Mesopotamian heat, temperatures that modern estimates place around 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, to position themselves in the open against an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 6-to-1. Here's what military historians still debate and can't fully explain. The march and fortification that followed should have killed half the force before they ever engaged the enemy. Men in heavy armor and chainmail, already exhausted from weeks of campaign, now forced to dig trenches in ground baked hard by the merciless sun, mere miles covered in hours that felt like days. The dust storms that constantly swept the Mesopotamian plains turned the road into a choking haze. Visibility dropped to yards. Men stumbled forward, following the standards and banners that were barely visible through the brown murk. Dehydration claimed dozens even before they reached the chosen battlefield. Horses faltered, their hooves kicking up more dust with each step. The water supplies that Belisarius had carefully rationed became more precious than gold. Every man knew that one misstep, one moment of weakness, could mean death even before the Persians attacked. But Belisarius had calculated something the Persians hadn't. He understood that the very extremity of his position, the seeming madness of deploying in the open, would work in his favor. Because Perozes would never expect it, would never believe that a Byzantine general would voluntarily give up the advantage of Dara's fortifications. While his men dug trenches in the brutal heat, Belisarius personally supervised the placement of each defensive work. The ditches weren't straight lines like traditional Roman fortifications. They angled forward on both flanks, creating a crescent formation. Between the trenches, carefully measured gaps, each one wide enough for cavalry to charge through but narrow enough to be defended by concentrated forces. The infantry, the least reliable troops in his force, would be positioned in the center behind the main trench, close enough to Dara's walls that supporting fire from the fortress could still reach over their heads. On the left and right flanks, his Byzantine cavalry of questionable quality. But supporting them on interior flanks, small bodies of Huns, 300 under Sunicas and Aegon on the left, another 300 under Simus and Ascan on the right. And here's the masterstroke that would change everything. Belisarius placed a body of 600 Herulian cavalry under the commander Phares in a hidden position behind a subtle rise on his left flank, invisible from the Persian approach. Unknown, unsuspected. A surprise that would shatter the enemy's first major assault. Behind his center, he held his own Bucellari, his household cavalry, the elite personal troops commanded by John the Armenian, his trusted friend, his reserve force for the critical moment when the battle hung in the balance. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the fortifications were complete. 7,000 exhausted men stood in positions that violated every military textbook, exposed on open ground, outnumbered catastrophically, with defensive works that no Persian commander had ever seen before. Belisarius walked the lines personally, speaking to clusters of soldiers. His voice carried confidence. His presence radiated calm. Today, we show the Persians that Romans still know how to fight, that tactics and courage outweigh numbers, that this ground, this dust and stone will remember Byzantine valor for 1,000 years. The men, despite their exhaustion, despite the mathematics of doom, began to believe. Because if this young general was insane enough to think they could win, perhaps insanity was just another word for genius. Meanwhile, several miles across the sun-scorched plains, Perozes had made the fatal decision that would cost him everything. Completely confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, He had allowed his army to advance without the tight formations that Persian doctrine normally demanded. Why maintain discipline when facing such obviously inferior numbers? Why exhaust troops with rigid march formations when the enemy would surely flee at the mere sight of 40,000 warriors? The Persian columns stretched loosely across the terrain, scouts grown complacent from weeks of easy advances. Officers were already discussing the division of spoils from Dara's capture. The rank and file sang marching songs, confident that by nightfall they would be feasting in the captured Byzantine fortress. Perozes himself had brought royal standards and ceremonial banners, the kind displayed during triumphal sieges, not desperate battles. He had sent messages back to King Kavad describing not a coming battle, but an inevitable capture. In his mind, Belisarius had only two choices: retreat into Dara and endure a siege, or flee entirely. The possibility that the Byzantine commander would offer battle in the open never seriously crossed his strategic calculations. This was the arrogance born of too many victories, the overconfidence that comes from facing enemies who always did the expected thing. The Persians had broken Byzantine armies before using the exact same tactics, overwhelming numbers combined with superior cavalry. Why would this time be any different? By midday on that scorching June day in 530 AD, Belisarius's impossible defensive position was complete. His scouts returned with electrifying news that made even exhausted Byzantine troops stand straighter. The Persians weren't formed for immediate battle. They were advancing in march column, spread out for ease of travel. Their cavalry wasn't deployed on the flanks. Their command structure was distributed across miles of dusty plain. They were vulnerable, exposed. Exactly as Belisarius had predicted, had gambled everything on predicting. God, it seemed, had delivered them exactly as the young general had prophesied. Not through divine intervention, but through the most reliable advantage in warfare: enemy mistakes born of contempt. The Persians saw 7,000 Byzantines and assumed automatic victory. They never considered that those 7,000 might be led by someone who understood that conventional tactics lose conventional battles. That innovation, desperate, unprecedented innovation, could transform hopeless odds into opportunity. As Persian advance elements first spotted Byzantine positions, they barely slowed. A raiding party, perhaps. Local troops making a doomed show of resistance before the inevitable retreat. Nothing that 40,000 warriors needed to fear. That contempt would prove lethal. Because while they were advancing casually, Belisarius's men were waiting behind fortifications the Persians had never encountered, preparing tactics the Persians had never faced, motivated by the knowledge that retreat was impossible and victory was survival. The stage was set. The trap was baited. All that remained was for the Persians to walk into it. The morning of battle dawned with that same scorching Mesopotamian heat, and Persian scouts had made their first critical mistake. They had underestimated what they were seeing. By midday, the first wind advantage became apparent. The prevailing winds blew from the Byzantine positions toward the Persian approach. This seemingly minor detail would prove tactically significant. Byzantine arrows would carry farther, while Persian volleys would fight headwinds. Belisarius's scouts had noted this pattern days earlier. Just another small advantage in the accumulation of small advantages that would determine the day. Belisarius's forward observers returned with news that made even exhausted troops stand straighter, grips tighten on weapons, hearts beat faster with something between hope and terror. The Persians were vulnerable on their flanks. Their columns were overextended. They were still transitioning from march formation to battle deployment. The window of opportunity was narrow, but it was there. At noon, Perozes received his first genuine warning that something was wrong. Dust clouds from Byzantine positions indicated significant troop movements, but his initial reaction was complete disbelief bordering on dismissal. His scouts had confirmed that Belisarius commanded only about 7,000 men. Even if every single one deployed outside the fortress, they represented no serious threat to 40,000 Persian warriors. It had to be a raiding party. Perhaps a desperate sortie designed to delay the inevitable siege. Perozes sent orders for light skirmishers to advance and probe the Byzantine position. nothing more. Certainly not worth deploying his full force or abandoning the leisurely pace of advance. This overconfidence would haunt him forever. But by mid-afternoon, the terrible truth became undeniable. Byzantine banners appeared on the ridgeline, not a minor force conducting a desperate sortie, but a fully deployed defensive line. Dug-in positions, disciplined formations, the unmistakable signs of an army prepared to give battle. Not a raiding party, but a deliberate challenge. Perozes' scattered forces began frantically trying to reform their lines from march column into battle formation. Officers shouted orders, cavalry units wheeled and repositioned, infantry blocks struggled to close up, but hours of casual advance had stretched the Persian army across miles of terrain. Closing up, reforming, preparing for coordinated assault, all of that takes time. And time is an eternity when your enemy is already formed, already positioned, already waiting with weapons ready and blood up. Worse, the Persians now had to deploy under Byzantine observation. Belisarius could watch their every movement, read their formations, anticipate their strategies. The advantage of surprise, the foundation of Persian confidence, had evaporated like morning dew under the Mesopotamian sun. As the afternoon wore on, the psychological advantage shifted. The Persians had expected a siege or a pursuit. Instead, they faced a prepared defense on unfamiliar ground using fortifications they'd never seen. Questions began to ripple through the Persian ranks. Why would Belisarius offer battle if he didn't have a plan? What did he know that they didn't? Perozes, recognizing that his initial contempt had been premature, now faced a choice. He could withdraw, reorganize, and attack the next day with proper preparation. But that would mean admitting his initial error would give the Byzantines more time to reinforce or adjust their positions, would appear indecisive to his troops. Or he could attack now with his overwhelming numbers and crush this Byzantine impudence through sheer force. 40,000 against 7,000. The mathematics still favored Persia overwhelmingly. Surely tactical preparation couldn't overcome that kind of numerical advantage. Perozes chose attack. Pride and overconfidence demanded it. The decision would doom thousands of his men and shatter his own reputation forever. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Persian army finally completed its battle deployment. Two massive lines stretching across the plain, infantry in the center, heavy cavalry on both flanks. The elite immortals held in reserve for the decisive blow, archers prepared to darken the sky with volleys. Across the dusty plain, 7,000 Byzantine soldiers watched that deployment with grim determination. They had marched into the impossible. They had dug trenches in the killing heat. They had committed everything to this single moment. Now they would discover whether genius could indeed triumph over numbers, whether innovation could defeat tradition, whether faith and desperation could rewrite the mathematics of warfare itself. The Battle of Dara was about to begin. Here's where legend collides with reality, where military doctrine shatters against necessity's anvil. Every manual of war, every precedent from centuries of Roman military theory, said the same thing with absolute certainty. Never fight outnumbered on open ground. Never rely on untested barbarian allies. Never innovate under pressure when proven tactics exist. Never abandon fortifications when facing superior numbers. Belisarius was about to violate every single one of these iron rules. His revolutionary decision represented something the Persians had never encountered in their campaigns against Byzantine forces. Instead of the traditional linear formation, straight lines of infantry with cavalry on the flanks, he ordered something unprecedented in open-field warfare against Persian armies. His 7,000 troops would fight from behind angled ditches that jutted forward on both flanks, creating a crescent formation. The ditches weren't continuous. They had carefully measured gaps between them, each gap positioned to allow cavalry sorties while being narrow enough to defend effectively. To every experienced officer who heard the command, it sounded like elaborate suicide. Angled fortifications exposed flanks to enemy cavalry sweeps. Gaps in defensive lines invited penetration and encirclement. The whole design seemed to violate fundamental defensive geometry. But Belisarius had seen something that Peroz's greater experience had caused him to overlook. The supposedly flat Mesopotamian plain wasn't actually flat. Subtle rises, gentle depressions, minor elevations, features invisible to casual observation but crucial to tactical maneuvering. The terrain channeled movement, created blind spots, offered concealment for forces that knew where to look. What appeared to be open ground ideally suited for Persian cavalry was actually broken by enough micro-terrain to enable ambush tactics. The young general had spent days studying this ground, walking every yard, noting every feature. While the Persians saw a featureless plain, Belisarius saw a battlefield that could multiply his inferior numbers through positioning and surprise. His infantry, the least reliable troops, the ones most likely to break under pressure, would hold the center behind the main trench. They were positioned close enough to Dara's walls that supporting fire from the fortress could still reach over their heads. City archers could rain arrows on any Persian breakthrough in the center without hitting their own forces. This gave the weakest part of his line the strongest support. On the left and right flanks were the Byzantine cavalry. Not elite troops, many were of questionable quality, equipped with whatever horses and weapons the empire could spare for this backwater frontier. But supporting them on interior flanks were the small bodies of Hun cavalry. 300 under Sunicas and Aigan on the left. 300 more under Simus and Ascan on the right. The Huns were lightly armored but supremely skilled in mobile archery and hit-and-run tactics. Positioned in the gaps between trenches, they could charge through, strike exposed flanks, and withdraw before enemy heavy cavalry could respond. Mobile firepower that could hit and evaporate like desert wind. But here's the masterstroke that contemporary sources emphasize. Behind the subtle rise on the left flank, completely invisible from the Persian approach, Belisarius concealed 600 Herulian cavalry under Faris. The Herulians were Germanic warriors, fierce, somewhat undisciplined, but devastating in sudden assaults. No Persian scout had detected them. No Persian commander knew they existed. This hidden force represented something revolutionary, a strategic reserve positioned for ambush rather than reinforcement. When the Persians attacked the Byzantine left, as Belisarius was certain they would, they'd expect to face only the visible cavalry. Instead, they'd find themselves flanked by a force they never knew existed. Behind the Byzantine center, Belisarius held his own bucellari, his household cavalry. These were elite troops, his personal retainers, men who had trained with him for years, commanded by John the Armenian, his childhood friend and most trusted lieutenant. This was the true reserve, the force that would decide the battle's critical moment. The defensive scheme was elegant in its complexity. Multiple layers of response, flexibility built into rigid-seeming positions, the ability to counterattack through ditch gaps while maintaining defensive integrity. Hidden forces ready to ambush enemy flanking maneuvers. It was the kind of tactical innovation that only desperation could inspire and only genius could execute. The Persians had spent centuries perfecting their approach to warfare. They knew every Roman defensive scheme, every Byzantine tactical response. Their experience was encyclopedic, but experience becomes liability when facing something genuinely new. And Belisarius had just created a defensive system the Persians had never seen, using principles they'd never encountered, exploiting terrain features they'd never considered significant. As the afternoon light slanted across the plains and Persian formations finally completed their deployment, Belisarius took one final walk along his defensive line. He spoke to clusters of soldiers, his voice carrying calm confidence that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The Persians see numbers and think victory is assured. They see our position and think we're desperate fools. They're half right. We are desperate. But desperation makes men fight like nothing else can. Today, these ditches, these positions you've prepared, they become the grave of Persian ambition. Today we prove that Roman valor hasn't died with the old empire. Today we show the world that tactics and courage outweigh mere numbers. The men, despite everything, despite the mathematics of doom, began to believe. Because if this plan was insanity, It was the kind of carefully calculated insanity that looked increasingly like genius. The Persians formed their lines, 40,000 warriors stretching across the plain like a living tapestry of silk and steel. War drums thundered, commanders shouted, horses stamped and snorted. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, and across that dusty space, 7,000 Byzantines waited behind trenches and hope, ready to discover whether the impossible could become inevitable. At exactly mid-afternoon, with the sun blazing at its cruelest angle, the Battle of Dara explodes into violence. Perozes, having finally deployed his forces properly, orders the assault. The Persian plan is textbook, proven through decades of successful campaigns. Fix the enemy center with arrow fire, then launch coordinated cavalry attacks against both flanks, break through, encircle, annihilate. Simple, effective, inevitable. Belisarius raises his sword from his command position. 7,000 men brace themselves against 40,000. The mathematics are still impossible, but the trap is set. The Persians begin with their standard opening, massed archery. 10,000 composite bows release in near unison. The sky darkens as arrows arc upward, so many that they literally block sunlight, casting shadows across the battlefield. The distinctive whistle hiss of thousands of shafts cutting air becomes a sound like swarming locusts. But the prevailing wind, that crucial detail Belisarius had noted, fights against the Persian arrows. Their range is shortened by yards, their accuracy decreased by feet. Meanwhile, Byzantine return fire carries farther, strikes harder. Still, arrows find targets. Men scream, shields splinter. The first casualties fall on both sides. Blood darkens the dust, but the Byzantine center holds behind their trench line, shields raised, formations intact. Then Perozes commits his first major assault. The Persian right wing under Commander Pityaxes, 20,000 heavy cavalry on the Persian right wheel and charge toward the Byzantine left flank. The sound is like continuous thunder rolling across stone. Hooves strike hard-packed earth. Armor clanks and jangles. Men roar battle cries in Parthian and Persian dialects. Lances lower in precision that speaks to years of training. This is the hammer that has shattered armies from the Indus to the Euphrates. They strike the Byzantine left at full gallop. In those first terrible seconds, hundreds of Persians simply cease to exist. The angled ditches that looked like defensive weakness prove their worth. Persian cavalry, expecting clear ground, instead find their charge disrupted. Horses stumble into ditches. Riders pitch forward. The careful formation dissolves into chaos as lead elements pile into unexpected obstacles. Those who navigate the ditches face concentrated missile fire from Byzantine positions. Arrows and javelins launched at point-blank range. Men and horses fall in tangled heaps. The Persian charge, so perfect in its initial formation, breaks apart like waves against rocks. But sheer numbers begin to tell. There are simply too many Persians. Despite casualties, despite disruption, they force crossings of the ditches. They push back the Byzantine cavalry on the left. For a moment, it appears that weight of numbers will overcome tactical innovation. Then Belisarius springs his first trap. From behind the subtle rise on the left, from terrain the Persians had dismissed as irrelevant, 600 Herulian cavalry under Faris explode into view. They charge into the exposed right flank of the Persian attack column. Germanic war cries mix with the thunder of hooves. Lances and swords strike men who never saw them coming. Simultaneously, from the interior Byzantine lines, Sunicus's 300 Hun cavalry burst through the planned gaps in the ditches. They strike the Persian left flank, the interior side of their attack column. Suddenly the hunters are trapped between two counterattacks. The Persians on the right wing, who moments before were pushing toward victory, find themselves caught in a vice. Herulians on one side, Huns on the other, Byzantine regular cavalry rallying in front. The psychological shock is as devastating as the physical assault. Persian officers try to restore order, but in the chaos of close combat, commands don't carry. Unit cohesion dissolves. The carefully trained cavalry breaks into individual melees where Persian numerical advantage means nothing. One-on-one combat in confined spaces favors desperation over discipline. Within minutes, the Persian right wing isn't just stopped, it's shattered. 3,000 Persian horsemen and foot soldiers die in the killing zone created by Belisarius's defensive scheme. Bodies pile in and around the ditches. Riderless horses gallop in panic. The survivors break and flee in complete disorder. The Byzantines have won the first major engagement. But the battle is far from over, because now Perozes, watching his right wing destroyed, makes his second critical decision. Rather than withdraw and reassess, he commits everything to breaking the Byzantine right flank. If he can shatter their defense there, numerical superiority will still carry the day. He orders forward his reserve, the elite Persian immortals, 10,000 of the finest heavy cavalry in the known world, veterans who have never known defeat, armored in lamellar that can turn blade strikes and deflect arrows, mounted on war horses bred for size and trained for combat. The immortals advance toward the Byzantine right wing in perfect formation, lances aligned, formations dressed, moving like a single organism of steel and death. Behind them come additional cavalry units drawn from the Persian center and left. Perhaps 15,000 horsemen total in this massive assault. If the Byzantine right collapses, the entire defensive position will unravel. Belisarius watches from his command post. This is the moment. Everything hangs on what happens in the next minutes. The immortals strike the Byzantine right wing with the force of an avalanche. Byzantine cavalry and infantry defending that sector are pushed back. There's no shame in it. The immortals are simply that good, that heavily armored, that overwhelmingly superior in individual combat capability. The Byzantine right begins to give ground, formations starting to waver. Officers shout desperately to maintain cohesion. Men die by the dozen. The ground becomes slippery with blood. For a terrifying moment, it appears the Persian breakthrough is inevitable. Then Belisarius commits his own reserve. John the Armenian, commanding Belisarius's elite Busalari household cavalry, receives the signal. Without hesitation, he leads the charge from the Byzantine center toward the threatened right flank. These are Belisarius's best troops, veterans of multiple campaigns, equipped with the finest weapons and armor the Byzantine Empire can provide, personally loyal to their commander. They crash into the right side of the Persian assault column. Not head-on, but at an angle, striking the formation's flank. The impact disrupts the immortals' careful advance. Men and horses go down. The inexorable push stutters. But John's cavalry alone aren't enough. There are simply too many Persians. Even elite troops can be overwhelmed by sheer mass. Belisarius has anticipated this. His orders have already been sent. From the Byzantine left, where Faris's Herulians and Sunicas' Huns have finished destroying the Persian right wing, cavalry units race across the battlefield toward the opposite flank. They're already bloodied, already exhausted, but they can see the crisis developing. They ride as if carrying the empire itself on their shoulders. Simas and Ascan's Hun cavalry from the Byzantine right, which had been supporting the defense, now execute a brilliant maneuver. Instead of retreating with the rest of the right wing, they gallop around the Persian column's rear. They position themselves to attack from behind. Now the Persian assault, this massive force of 15,000, including the elite immortals, finds itself flanked from both sides and threatened from behind. The hunters have become the hunted. The hammer has struck an anvil it cannot break. The Persian left-wing commander, Barismanas, a veteran of dozens of battles, tries desperately to maintain formation discipline. He shouts orders in the chaos. He rallies men around his standard. For a moment, his presence holds the formation together through sheer force of personality. Then a Byzantine lance finds him. Barismanas falls from his saddle, mortally wounded. The standard he carried drops into blood-soaked dust. The psychological impact is immediate and catastrophic. The immortals, men who have never fled from battle, see their commander fall. They see Byzantine cavalry on all sides. They see the carefully planned assault dissolving into surrounded chaos. And for the first time in their legendary history, they waver. That moment of hesitation proves fatal. Byzantine forces, sensing weakness, press harder. The envelopment tightens. What had been a powerful assault becomes a desperate attempt to escape. Formation discipline breaks. Units become crowds. Crowds become mobs. 5,000 more Persians die in this killing zone. The elite immortals, who have been the terror of Byzantine nightmares for generations, break and run. The sight of their retreat shatters whatever morale remains in the rest of the Persian army. If the immortals can't stand against these Byzantines, what hope do ordinary soldiers have? The answer, written in blood across the dusty plains, is none at all. By late afternoon, as the sun descends toward the western horizon, something unprecedented occurs on the plains outside Dara. The Persian center, 20,000 of their finest remaining troops who haven't yet engaged, begins to waver. Not an organized retreat, not even a fighting withdrawal. They begin to shatter like pottery dropped on stone. The Persian officers can't believe their eyes. They command overwhelming numbers. The Byzantines are exhausted, bloodied, should be at the breaking point themselves. How can 7,000 exhausted Byzantines be pushing back nearly 6 times their number? The physics don't work. The mathematics are impossible. Yet it is happening before their disbelieving eyes. Here's what breaks armies. Not casualties alone, but the destruction of belief. The Persians had marched from Nisibis absolutely certain of victory. They had seen the numbers. They had calculated the odds. They had planned celebration feasts. Victory wasn't just expected, it was mathematically guaranteed. Then they watched their right wing destroyed by enemies that seemed to materialize from nowhere. They witnessed the invincible immortals, the elite of the elite, broken and fleeing. They saw both their flanking assaults not just stopped, but annihilated. And they realized that everything they had believed about this battle was wrong. Panic is a virus that spreads faster than arrows fly. It begins with a few men backing away from the front line. Those few become dozens. Dozens become hundreds. Officers shout orders that go unheard or ignored. Unit cohesion, that fragile thing that separates armies from mobs, disintegrates. Within minutes, the initial break becomes a rout. Commands become screams. Formations dissolve into chaos. Men throw down weapons and run. Cavalry abandons infantry. Units fragment. The massive Persian force that had stretched across the plain like an unstoppable tide becomes a stampede of terrified survivors trying to escape. The impossible is happening. 40,000 warriors are being routed by a force they outnumber nearly 6 to 1. Perozes, from his command position, watches his army disintegrate. He faces the commander's nightmare, total loss of control. His orders no longer reach his units. His standards no longer rally his men. The carefully constructed command structure, the product of decades of Persian military development, has evaporated in less than an hour of combat. He makes the decision that will haunt him for whatever days remain of his career and life. He orders full withdrawal, a euphemism for headlong flight. He abandons the field in complete disarray. The sight of their overall commander fleeing on horseback destroys the last threads of Persian resistance. If Perozes himself has given up, if the man who led them here is running for his life, what possible reason do common soldiers have to stand and die? The royal standards that Perozes had brought for triumphal display, those banners meant to fly over conquered Dara, are left behind in the mud, trampled by fleeing soldiers, captured by pursuing Byzantines, symbols of humiliation rather than glory. Evening brings what Roman historians would later call the massacre of the fleeing. The Persian elite immortals, 10,000 men renowned for unbreakable resolve, who had faced death in countless wars without flinching, are fleeing in complete disorder. These warriors, who represented the pinnacle of Persian military excellence, whose very name struck fear across 3 continents, run like broken conscripts. The sight shatters what little morale remains anywhere in the Persian army. If the immortals flee, if these legendary warriors have abandoned the field, what hope do common soldiers have? The answer spreads through the routing army with the speed of wildfire. None. Byzantine forces, their blood up with the intoxication of impossible victory, begin the pursuit. But Belisarius, even in this moment of triumph, maintains tactical discipline. He orders a controlled pursuit. Chase the enemy, inflict casualties, but don't let the army fragment into individual glory-seeking that could leave them vulnerable to reorganized counterattack. The pursuit becomes a running massacre that lasts until dusk. Byzantine cavalry, their exhaustion forgotten in the adrenaline of victory, chase fleeing Persians for miles across the Mesopotamian plain. The killing is mechanical, efficient, horrible in its one-sided nature. Swords rise and fall with the rhythm of harvest work. Arrows find backs of fleeing soldiers who have thrown away shields. The air fills with cries of agony, pleas for mercy in Persian and Parthian dialects that Byzantine soldiers either don't understand or choose to ignore. The very ground becomes slippery with blood. Dust turns to mud from the gore. Herulian cavalry, already blooded from the initial flank attack, show no mercy. They pursue with the ferocity of Germanic warriors who have spent generations raiding and being raided. For them, this is vengeance for every Byzantine fortress the Persians have ever captured, every border raid they've ever suffered. The Hun mercenaries employ their traditional tactics with devastating effectiveness. Mobile archery allows them to ride alongside fleeing Persians, shooting at close range without even slowing their horses. Men fall with arrows in their backs, sides, necks. The Huns' whooping war cries mix with screams of the dying. Byzantine regular cavalry, who had spent the battle defending trenches, now taste pursuit. They chase down isolated groups, cut off escape routes, funnel fleeing enemies into killing zones where infantry can finish them. The tactics of ambush and envelopment that had worked so brilliantly in defensive mode now prove equally effective in pursuit. But Belisarius, riding among his troops with John the Armenian at his side, repeatedly restrains the pursuit from going too far. He knows that exhausted victors can become vulnerable to ambush themselves. He understands that a routed enemy given space to flee will continue fleeing. But a routed enemy pursued to the point of desperation might turn and fight with nothing to lose ferocity. So the pursuit extends for miles but remains controlled. Byzantine cavalry chase down the slowest Persians, the wounded, the isolated groups. But they don't pursue the main body of fleeing troops all the way back to Nisibis. Belisarius lets the survivors run, lets them carry news of the disaster back to their bases. Because sometimes the best victory is one where survivors live to spread fear and tales of defeat. As darkness finally falls across the Mesopotamian plains, horns sound across the Byzantine lines. The recall. Time to break off pursuit and return to positions. Soldiers, many of them barely able to comprehend what they've accomplished, turn their horses back toward Dara. The battlefield they return to is a scene from nightmares. A killing ground that will haunt the memories of everyone who sees it. A testament to what happens when tactical genius meets superior numbers and emerges victorious. When the arrows finally fall silent at sunset and the last pursuit parties return to the defensive lines, the killing ground reveals scenes that will haunt chroniclers for centuries. 8,000 Persian dead carpet the plains outside Dara in twisted heaps. Bodies are piled in the ditches where they fell trying to cross. Some trenches are literally filled with the corpses of men and horses. On the flanks where the envelopments occurred, the dead lie in dense clusters, men who were caught in killing zones with nowhere to run. Persian immortals lie among common soldiers, elite cavalry alongside infantry levies, officers with ornate armor next to conscripts in simple cloth and leather. Death, in its terrible democracy, has claimed all ranks equally. Horses are strewn across the battlefield like broken toys. Hundreds of expensive war horses, bred for size and trained for combat, now just carrion for the vultures that are already beginning to circle. Equipment worth fortunes lies scattered and trampled. Silk banners mudded beyond recognition. Weapons too numerous to count abandoned in panic. Against this carnage, Byzantine casualties seem almost miraculous. Fewer than 100 dead from the original 7,000. Even accounting for wounded, perhaps another 500 seriously injured, another 1,000 with minor wounds. The exchange rate is staggering. 80-1. For every Byzantine soldier killed, 80 Persians lie dead. The kind of casualty ratio that sounds like propaganda rather than battle report. Yet the evidence carpets the ground in undeniable reality. The immediate material gains defy easy calculation. The Persians' army had carried wealth sufficient to sustain 40,000 men through a siege. Gold for pay, supplies, equipment, spare weapons. In the span of hours, all of it has become Byzantine property. More importantly, they've captured Persian standards and baggage trains. The symbolic value of those royal banners will resonate across the empire. But here's what Procopius, the great historian who would later document these events, reveals about the true cost. The victory, spectacular as it appears, bought time rather than permanent security. Exhaustion plagued the victors, limiting pursuit, and allowing perhaps 32,000 Persians to escape and eventually regroup. The win demonstrated what tactical innovation could achieve. It proved that Byzantine forces, properly led and positioned, could defeat numerically superior Persian armies. It shattered the myth of Persian invincibility that had paralyzed Byzantine strategic thinking for decades. But it didn't end the war. It didn't capture Nisibis. It didn't destroy the Persian military capacity to threaten the eastern frontier. One brilliant defensive victory, no matter how spectacular, couldn't resolve the fundamental strategic problem. The Sassanid Empire remained powerful, wealthy, and determined to expand westward. Within a year, the Persians would launch another invasion via a different route. Belisarius would face them again at Callinicum and lose, proving that even genius can't win every time. Eventually, in 532, the Eternal Peace Treaty would be signed, with Byzantium paying tribute for peace. But none of that diminishes what happened on June 530 AD on the plains outside Dara. For one day, against impossible odds, tactical brilliance and desperate courage rewrote the rules of warfare. For one day, 7,000 men proved that sometimes the mathematics of battle include variables that can't be quantified: leadership, innovation, the human will to achieve the impossible. As Byzantine soldiers walked through the killing ground that evening, searching for wounded comrades and stripping Persian dead of valuables, they understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, a battle that would be studied for centuries, a victory that would echo through military history. The day when Belisarius proved that youth and innovation could triumph over experience and numbers. The day when 7,000 became legend. The news of the Battle of Dara reaches Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, days later. Exhausted messengers who have ridden non-stop through the Mesopotamian heat deliver reports that King Kavod III initially refuses to believe. Impossible, he insists. 40,000 Persian warriors don't lose to 7,000 Byzantines. The numbers don't work. There must be some mistake in the reports. Perhaps the messengers misunderstood. Perhaps they exaggerate Byzantine numbers or minimize Persian casualties. But as more survivors straggle back, as more accounts arrive from multiple sources, the terrible truth becomes undeniable. The empire that has conquered vast territories from the Indus to the Euphrates has suffered one of its most catastrophic defeats at the hands of outnumbered Byzantine forces. Kavadha. I receives the confirmed reports in stunned silence. Courtiers who had anticipated celebration of Dara's capture instead witnessed their kings face age years in moments. The old ruler, already in declining health, suffers what court physicians describe as an affliction of the spirits, likely a stress-induced illness that accelerates his already failing condition. The psychological shockwave ripples through every level of Persian society with the force of an earthquake. In Ctesiphon, nobles and administrators who had been planning victory celebrations now scramble to assign blame and protect their positions. The court becomes a cauldron of accusations. Who was responsible? How could such disaster occur? Perozes is denounced in absentia, a scapegoat for a defeat that resulted as much from systemic overconfidence as individual failure. From the noble houses to the merchant quarters to the peasant villages, disbelief spreads like plague. The Persian military machine, which had seemed invincible for generations, has been broken by a Byzantine general most Persians had never heard of. Morale in frontier garrisons plummets. Soldiers begin to question whether their numerical advantages mean anything if Byzantine tactics can nullify them. Strategic calculations shift across the eastern provinces. Border regions that had been preparing to welcome Persian occupation suddenly find renewed Byzantine confidence threatening their carefully hedged allegiances. Armenian princes reconsider their diplomatic positions. Tribes in the Caucasus reassess whether Persian dominance is as inevitable as they'd believed. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the news triggers celebrations of almost delirious intensity. Justinian I, who had gambled on Belisarius despite the young general's age and limited experience, is vindicated spectacularly. The emperor, who had faced whispers about his judgment, doubts about his military appointments, now looks like a strategic genius for recognizing Belisarius's potential. Relief sweeps through Dara's walls and across Byzantine Mesopotamia like a warm wind. Church bells ring continuously for 3 days. Civilians pour into streets, celebrating survival and victory. Priests hold special liturgies thanking God for delivering the empire from seemingly certain disaster. Most importantly, the victory secures Mesopotamia from immediate invasion. The eastern frontier, which had appeared on the verge of collapse, suddenly stabilizes. Fortress garrisons that had been preparing for siege now stand ready to take the offensive. The psychological transformation is as significant as the tactical victory. For Belisarius personally, the implications are profound. Overnight, he transforms from promising young commander into the most celebrated general in the Byzantine Empire. Letters from Justinian arrive carrying imperial commendations and new appointments. The doubters and rivals who had questioned his youth now scramble to associate themselves with his success. But Belisarius, walking through the aftermath of battle, understands something that celebration and triumph obscure. This is one victory in a long war. The Persians remain powerful, they will return, and next time they won't make the same mistakes. The seeds of future conflict are already germinating, even as Byzantine civilians dance in the streets and Persian courtiers plot their recriminations. Because neither empire can truly afford peace, and neither can definitively win war. The eternal struggle between Rome and Persia will continue, as it has for centuries, as it will for decades more. But for this moment, for these weeks of celebration, the impossible has been achieved. 7,000 Byzantines have defeated 40,000 Persians. The mathematics of despair have been rewritten into equations of hope, and a 25-year-old general has carved his name into military history with the tools of innovation, courage, and tactical brilliance. The echoes of that achievement will resonate for centuries. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Dara unfold across the following year with the force of a tidal wave reshaping the eastern Mediterranean geopolitical landscape. Border fortresses that had trembled at the approach of Persian armies suddenly find new courage. Garrisons that had prepared for desperate defense now contemplate offensive operations. Commanders who had written defeatist reports now send optimistic assessments to Constantinople. The psychological transformation is as significant as any territorial gain. Antioch, the jewel of the Byzantine East, falls under stronger protection throughout 531 AD. Imperial resources that had been held in reserve, uncertain of where to commit them, now flow eastward. New troops are recruited and trained. Fortifications are strengthened. Supply depots are expanded. The entire defensive architecture of the eastern provinces undergoes reinforcement based on renewed confidence in Byzantine military capacity. The very fortresses that had been considered indefensible are now held firmly. Dara itself, from threatened outpost, becomes a symbol of Byzantine resilience. Pilgrims begin visiting the battlefield, an unusual practice that speaks to the legendary status the engagement quickly acquires. Within months, the ditches where Persians died are being pointed out like sacred sites. But here's what military historians discover when they study the battle's tactical innovations centuries later. The Battle of Dara becomes the template for an entirely new approach to defensive warfare. The principles Belisarius perfected on that June day in 530 AD, angled fortifications creating killing zones, carefully positioned gaps allowing counterattacks, hidden reserves positioned for ambush, flexible response using interior lines of communication. These principles echo through military theory for over 1,000 years. Napoleon studies accounts of Dara before Austerlitz. The manipulation of terrain, to channel enemy movements, the use of hidden forces to exploit enemy overextension, the psychological dimension of appearing weak to invite enemy commitment. All of these have roots in Belisarius's defensive masterpiece. Wellington at Waterloo employs remarkably similar principles: reverse slope defense, concealed reserves, angled defensive works creating enfilade fire positions. The tactics are adapted to muskets and cannon rather than bows and lances, but the underlying strategic logic remains Belisarian. Even trench warfare in World War I employs concepts that trace lineage to Dara: defensive ditches forcing enemy formations into predictable paths, gaps for counterattack, the use of terrain features to multiply defensive strength. The scale is vastly larger, the weapons incomparably more lethal, but the fundamental insight remains. Properly fortified defenders can inflict catastrophic casualties on numerically superior attackers. The cultural memory of June 530 AD embeds itself in Byzantine consciousness with surprising permanence. Epic poems emerge celebrating Belisarius's victory. Mosaics in churches depict the battle with theological overtones, God granting victory to the faithful few against pagan multitudes. The parallels to David and Goliath are drawn repeatedly in sermons and literature. Centuries later, even after the Byzantine Empire's fall, Greek-speaking communities preserve stories of the battle. Ottoman chroniclers, inheriting the region's military traditions, study accounts of Dara and incorporate lessons into their own tactical development. The engagement becomes one of those rare battles that transcends its immediate historical moment to achieve permanent educational value. Modern military academies, West Point in America, Sandhurst in Britain, Saint-Cyr in France, include the Battle of Dara in curricula on defensive tactics and the principles of asymmetric warfare. Officers study Belisarius's deployment diagrams, analyze his decision-making process, debate whether his victory resulted more from tactical brilliance or Persian mistakes. The consensus among military historians: both. Tactical brilliance created the conditions where Persian mistakes became fatal rather than merely inconvenient. Belisarius's genius lay not in preventing enemy errors. He couldn't control what the Persians did, but in creating a tactical situation where enemy errors would be catastrophically punished. This represents a fundamental insight about warfare that the Battle of Dara illustrates perfectly. Superior tactics do not guarantee victory, but they create opportunities for victory that inferior tactics can never access. When those opportunities arise, through enemy mistakes, environmental factors, the chaos of battle, properly positioned forces can exploit them decisively. The principles distilled from Dara become military maxims. Deception through fortification, appear weaker than you are, invite enemy commitment, then reveal hidden strength at the decisive moment. Flank ambushes, use terrain and concealment to position forces where the enemy doesn't expect them, strike at vulnerable moments. Morale-breaking counters, identify the psychological linchpins of enemy confidence, like the Immortals, target them specifically, and shatter enemy belief in inevitable victory. Unity of command, ensure one commander controls all forces, enabling coordinated response to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. These principles, proven on the dusty plains outside Dara, become foundational to defensive doctrine across civilizations and centuries. Belisarius's day-long masterpiece becomes a template for asymmetric warfare that remains relevant as long as smaller forces must face larger enemies. But perhaps the battle's greatest legacy lies not in its tactical innovations or strategic consequences, but in what it reveals about human potential. Against mathematically impossible odds, properly led forces achieved what every calculation said was unachievable. Innovation trumped numbers. Preparation overcame disadvantage. Courage and desperation, channeled through tactical brilliance, rewrote the equations of warfare. In that sense, the Battle of Dara becomes more than a military engagement. It becomes a philosophical statement about the relationship between human will and circumstance, between innovation and tradition, between the possible and the impossible. Belisarius himself rises to even greater fame and more daunting challenges in the years following his triumph at Dara. The general who achieved the impossible continues his campaigns with victories that cement his reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. In 533–534 AD, he leads the expedition against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, conquering it in a lightning campaign that restores Roman rule to territory lost nearly a century earlier. In 535–540 AD, he campaigns in Italy against the Ostrogoths, recapturing Rome itself and pushing Gothic forces to the brink of destruction. His string of victories seems to validate everything Justinian believed about him, that tactical brilliance and innovation could restore the Roman Empire to its former glory despite limited resources and numerical disadvantages. But Belisarius's remaining years prove that battlefield success doesn't translate automatically into political security. Victorious but constantly plagued by court intrigue, he faces jealous rivals who poison Justinian's mind with suspicions. Did Belisarius aspire to imperial power himself? Did his loyalty to the throne remain absolute, or was ambition growing? The emperor who had celebrated his general's victories increasingly sees him as a potential threat. In 541, Belisarius is recalled from Italy just as complete victory seems achievable, not because he's failing, but because he's succeeding too brilliantly. The empire that can't afford his defeat apparently also can't afford his total triumph. He's sent east again to face renewed Persian invasions, then back to Italy, then recalled again in a cycle of deployment and suspicion that wastes his talents. By the 550s and 560s, Belisarius is an old man by the standards of his era, worn down by decades of campaigning, crippled by wounds, exhausted by constant political battles that prove more draining than military ones. He's stripped of commands, briefly reinstated, then dismissed again as Justinian's paranoia deepens with age. When Belisarius dies in 565 AD, the same year as Justinian, enemies whisper stories about his final years. Some claim he was blinded and reduced to begging in the streets of Constantinople, though most historians dismiss this as malicious legend. The truth is probably less dramatic but equally tragic. A great general dying in relative obscurity, his achievements half forgotten by a court consumed with newer intrigues and younger favorites. Yet even in death, his legend grows. The world mourns what it lost when Belisarius's brilliance was constrained by political machinations. Historians, poets, and military theorists preserve and embellish his story. The Battle of Dara becomes the centerpiece of his legend, the moment when a 25-year-old commander proved that genius could overcome any odds. The opposing commander Perozes meets a grimmer, more immediate fate. Of the 40,000 men who had marched confidently toward Dara expecting easy victory, approximately 32,000 survive, a casualty rate of 20% killed or captured. But the psychological casualties are far higher. The survivors return to Nisibis defeated, demoralized, bearing news of catastrophic failure. Unit cohesion is shattered. Confidence in Persian tactical superiority is broken. Perozes himself faces immediate disgrace. The commander who was supposed to deliver an easy victory has instead presided over one of the most humiliating defeats in Persian military history. Court politics in Ctesiphon are merciless toward failure at this scale. Historical sources differ on his exact fate. Some suggest he was stripped of command immediately and faced court-martial. Others indicate he retained nominal position, but was effectively sidelined from any future significant command. The consensus is that his career ended at Dara, a promising general's reputation destroyed in a single day of miscalculation and overconfidence. Persian chroniclers, when they mention him at all in later years, use his name as a cautionary tale. A lion led sheep to slaughter, observers note with bitter irony. The commander who had every advantage, numbers, equipment, experience, strategic position, managed to lose to an enemy who by all conventional calculation should have been annihilated. What doomed Perozes wasn't lack of skill or courage. It was the fatal combination of overconfidence, contempt for the enemy, and inability to adapt when initial assumptions proved wrong. He expected Byzantine forces to behave according to established patterns. When Belisarius instead innovated, Perozes continued following conventional doctrine rather than adjusting to unprecedented circumstances. His failure becomes a lesson that echoes through military education. Experience becomes liability when it prevents adaptation to novel situations. The veteran's confidence that they've seen it all before blinds them to genuine innovation. Sometimes the young commander with limited experience but unlimited creativity proves more dangerous than the seasoned general with decades of victories won the same way. In the end, both commanders' fates illustrate different truths about military service in the ancient world. Belisarius achieves legendary status, but suffers the political consequences of being too successful, too brilliant, too threatening to insecure rulers. Perozes suffers immediate disgrace for a defeat that resulted as much from systemic Persian overconfidence as personal failure. Yet history remembers them both, one as a tactical genius whose brilliance was wasted by political stupidity, the other as a cautionary example of what happens when superior numbers meet superior tactics and the numbers lose. The contrast between their careers highlights warfare's ultimate irony. Victory and defeat are temporary, but the lessons they teach endure. The Battle of Dara becomes immortal not because it ended the Byzantine-Persian conflict, it didn't, but because it demonstrated timeless principles about leadership, innovation, and the relationship between tactics and numbers. Principles that remain relevant as long as smaller forces must face larger enemies, as long as innovation challenges tradition, as long as desperate circumstances demand extraordinary responses. In that sense, both commanders' legacies transcend their personal fates. They become characters in a larger narrative about the nature of warfare itself. Modern militaries still study the Battle of Dara as the ultimate case study in asymmetric warfare, the definitive example of how tactical innovation can overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Staff colleges from West Point to Sandhurst to the French École de Guerre teach the Dara principles as foundational doctrine. Officers study deployment diagrams showing Belisarius's angled trench system. They analyze decision trees mapping his responses to different Persian attacks. They debate whether his victory was replicable or whether specific circumstances made it unique. The tactical lessons distilled from Dara become core components of defensive warfare theory. Deception through fortification, creating defensive works that appear weaker than they are, inviting enemy commitment while hiding true strength. Modern equivalents include false fortification lines, dummy positions, and the strategic use of camouflage and concealment. Flank ambushes using concealed reserves, the principle that uncommitted forces, properly positioned, multiply effective combat power far beyond their numbers. Every military tradition incorporates this insight, from German infiltration tactics in World War I to modern special operations doctrine emphasizing surprise and concentration of force at decisive points. Morale-breaking counters, targeting psychological linchpins, identifying what the enemy believes makes them invincible, like the Persian immortals, then specifically targeting that belief. When the unbreakable element breaks, the psychological cascade shatters entire formations. Modern psychological operations doctrine traces directly to insights like these. Unity of command, enabling flexible response, ensuring one commander controls all forces and can rapidly reallocate resources to exploit developing opportunities. The alternative, divided command, committee decision-making, rigid adherence to pre-battle plans, consistently produces defeat when facing competent opponents. Beyond specific tactical lessons, the Battle of Dara becomes a case study in the limits and possibilities of innovation under pressure. Can genius truly overcome impossible odds? Does tactical brilliance really matter against overwhelming numbers? The answer Dara provides is nuanced, yes, but only when multiple factors align. Belisarius needed Persian overconfidence to create opportunities for exploitation. He needed favorable terrain features that weren't immediately obvious. He needed troops willing to trust unconventional tactics. He needed enemy commanders who continued following doctrine even when doctrine was clearly failing. Remove any one of these factors, and the battle's outcome might have been very different. This nuanced lesson proves more valuable than simplistic triumphalism. The Battle of Dara doesn't prove that small forces always defeat large ones through clever tactics. It proves that small forces can create conditions where victory becomes possible, then exploit those conditions when circumstances align favorably. Perhaps the battle's greatest philosophical legacy lies not in its tactical specifics, but in what it reveals about human will and possibility. The Battle of Dara proves that innovation can triumph over tradition when tradition becomes complacency. That numerical disadvantage isn't destiny when tactical creativity creates force multipliers. That leadership matters, perhaps matters more than any other single factor in determining combat outcomes. In the crucible of desperation, facing mathematically impossible odds, Belisarius discovered tactical solutions that hadn't existed before. Necessity didn't just mother invention, it demanded it. The young general facing career-ending defeat or legendary victory chose innovation over convention, creativity over doctrine, possibility over probability. That choice, and its spectacular vindication on the blood-soaked plains outside Dara, becomes a permanent challenge to military conservatism. Whenever commanders argue that established methods are sufficient, that innovation is unnecessary risk-taking, the ghost of Belisarius whispers, "I faced 40,000 with 7,000, and won by refusing to fight the way they expected." But the battle's legacy contains a cruel irony that's often overlooked in celebrations of the victory. The Battle of Dara's very success sowed seeds of strategic overconfidence in Byzantine military thinking. If tactical brilliance could overcome 6-to-1 numerical disadvantages, perhaps the empire didn't need to invest in larger armies. Perhaps clever generals were sufficient. Perhaps resource limitations didn't matter when commanders were innovative enough. This overconfidence contributed to future disasters. Within a year, at Callinicum, Belisarius himself would face defeat when Persian commanders learned from Dara and refused to obligingly walk into his tactical traps. Later, Byzantine commanders would attempt to replicate his methods without his genius, leading to catastrophic losses. Victory over the Persians at Dara couldn't prevent later defeats when tactics became predictable or when enemies adapted to Byzantine innovations. The eternal cycle of warfare continued. Innovation breeds counter-innovation, advantages erode, new methods are required. One brilliant victory, no matter how spectacular, couldn't permanently resolve the strategic competition between empires. Yet this limitation doesn't diminish the achievement. The Battle of Dara remains a permanent monument to what's possible when human creativity confronts impossible circumstances and refuses to accept predetermined outcomes. For military officers studying the battle 15 centuries later, the core lesson remains vital. Tactics matter. Leadership matters. Innovation matters. Numbers aren't destiny. Conventional wisdom isn't wisdom when circumstances demand unconventional responses. These insights, purchased with the blood of 8,000 Persians and 100 Byzantines on a dusty Mesopotamian plain in June 530 AD, remain as relevant in the 21st century as they were in the 6th. The technologies change. The strategic contexts evolve. The fundamental truths about warfare and human potential endure. That endurance is Belisarius's true legacy. Not the temporary strategic advantage his victory provided to the Byzantine Empire, but the permanent intellectual contribution to understanding how small forces can defeat large ones when properly led and tactically innovative. As long as armies study warfare, they will study Dara. As long as commanders face numerical disadvantage, they will seek inspiration from Belisarius. As long as military theory values the relationship between tactics and morale, innovation and tradition, the possible and the impossible, June 530 AD will remain legendary. June 530 AD. The dawn that had hidden 7,000 desperate Byzantine soldiers behind hastily dug trenches gives way to dusk that reveals 8,000 Persian dead carpeting the plains outside Dara. The mathematics that had seemed so simple that morning, 40,000 versus 7,000, nearly 6-to-1, inevitable Persian victory, have been rewritten in blood and tactical brilliance. The impossible has become historical fact. Yet the leader who achieved this miracle discovers what conquerors throughout history have learned. Some victories carry burdens heavier than defeats. Belisarius will spend the next 35 years campaigning across 3 continents, winning battles that should have been unwinnable, restoring territories that had been lost for generations. And he'll spend those same years fighting political battles against jealous rivals, defending himself from suspicions of disloyalty, watching his achievements undermined by the very empire he served so brilliantly. In proving that tactics can triumph over numbers, that innovation can overcome tradition, that a 25-year-old commander with radical ideas can defeat seasoned generals with conventional wisdom, Belisarius wrote the greatest military upset in ancient warfare history. He secured Justinian's throne when it was most vulnerable. He demonstrated that the Byzantine Empire still possessed the martial excellence that had once made Rome supreme. The greatest defensive stand in Byzantine history achieved everything except what its architect most desired: lasting peace and imperial gratitude. The eastern frontier would remain contested for centuries.
The Persians would return. New enemies would emerge. And Belisarius himself would find that political survival proved more challenging than military victory. But for this one day, for these hours when the sun beat down mercilessly on desperate men facing impossible odds, everything aligned perfectly. Tactical innovation met strategic opportunity. Leadership met necessity. Courage met desperation.
And 7,000 Byzantine warriors, facing 40,000 Persian invaders, discovered that sometimes faith and strategy can indeed rewrite destiny. When the impossible becomes inevitable, when ingenuity conquers numerical superiority, when preparation transforms disadvantage into dominance, armies discover that victory belongs not to the many, but to the bold. Not to those who follow established doctrine, but to those who rewrite it. Not to commanders who accept the odds, but to leaders who defy them. On June 530 AD, on the dusty plains outside a fortress called Dara, 7,000 men stood against 40,000 and won. They won through trenches dug at angles that channeled enemy cavalry into killing zones, through hidden reserves that turned Persian flanking attacks into envelopments, through psychological warfare that shattered the confidence of supposedly unbreakable elite troops, through the kind of tactical brilliance that appears once in a generation, if that. When the dust settled over those plains, the survivors had proven something that echoes through every military academy, every staff college, every tactical manual written in the 15 centuries since. That genius can overcome odds, that innovation defeats tradition, that sometimes, just sometimes, the mathematics of warfare include factors that can't be quantified. Courage, leadership, the desperate refusal to accept predetermined defeat, the willingness to risk everything on unconventional tactics. These intangibles, when combined with careful preparation and tactical skill, create possibilities that pure calculation says shouldn't exist. The Battle of Dara stands eternal testament to those possibilities. A reminder that when circumstance demands the impossible and leadership provides the vision, human beings can achieve what every reasonable calculation says they cannot. 7,000 against 40,000. 6-to-1 odds. And when the arrows fell silent and the pursuit ended, the smaller force had won one of history's most spectacular victories. That's the legacy of June 530 AD. That's the lesson of Belisarius at Dara. That's the truth that survived 15 centuries and remains as vital today as it was the day it was written in blood on Mesopotamian dust. The impossible is only impossible until someone proves otherwise.